close this one. So I want to talk tonight about how and why birds sing, and I'm going to approach it, a bit based on my background as a scientist. And so, so here, we can hear this this wood thrush, right? So we want to talk about how is it producing those sounds, right? And then why is it producing those sounds? How does it gain by producing those particular sounds? Right? So first thing to talk about is how scientists ask questions. And so I'm going to rely on this quote from Ernst Mayr, who's one of the preeminent biologists of the 20th century. And you can see he lived quite a long life from 1904 to 2005. And in fact, he published his last book when he was 100 years old. Right? And he had retired from Harvard University for many, many years. And he was a very prominent evolutionary biologist, but he initially trained as an ornithologist, and you can see a picture of him as a young man in Papua New Guinea, where he went on he left Germany and came to New York, worked at the American Museum of Natural History, and went on a very long bird collecting trip to Papua New Guinea. And he was very interested in speciation. Why are there so many different species of birds? But he was also very interested in the philosophy of biology and the philosophy of science. And so as he says, questions which begin with what and how are sufficient explanations in the physical sciences, right, like chemistry, physics. In the biological sciences, no explanation is complete until a third type of question is asked, and that is the question why. Why do we see this particular trait? Why do we see this particular behavior? Why do birds sing? Right? Why do birds sing? Right? And so there are really two levels of explanation. One is what we can think of as approximate level, like the answers to what and the how questions. So that's like what muscles are involved, what nerves are involved, what hormones are involved, what kind of stimuli elicit behavior, what causes a bird to sing, what kind of environmental stimuli causes a bird to sing, how does it develop in an individual from a hatchling to an adult, for example, what kind of mechanisms cause age differences and differences between males and females and so on, and what kind of roles do genes play in producing bird song or learning? Because some birds learn their song, some other birds don't learn their song. So think of a couple of good examples. So one bird that's been studied a lot, we'll look at it later, is the white-crowned sparrow. They learn their songs. Brown-headed cowbirds, their songs are hardwired because they can't really learn them from other brown-headed cowbirds because they're reared and nested in other species. But then they modify their songs later on based on how females respond to them. So it's also important to remember that all the behaviors, like bird song, are influenced by both genes, right, that build the structures that are used to produce sounds, right? And it's also influenced by the environment. And so it's always important to keep that separation in mind. In my research, I've really kind of focused mostly on some of these ultimate questions, right? Explain why do they sing, right? And those are, at least in Ernst Mayr's mind, it's what we're really talking about is evolutionary explanations. So how did that behavior evolve? And one way you can get an idea of how that behavior might have evolved, is by looking at close or distant relatives. What did they do? Right? That gives you some idea, right? What's the evolutionary history of the behavior? Why do they do it? Right? What is done? And what's the outcome of doing that behavior? And what's the design or purpose of that behavior? What purpose does it serve? And is the behavior adaptive? And what we mean when we say behavior is adaptive or a trait is adaptive, like birdsong, is that it does two things. It increases the survivorship of the individual, and it increases their reproductive success. And survivorship is only a means to reproductive success, right? Getting the genes into the next generation. So song is an adaptation. And if we say something from a biological perspective, an adaptation has three characteristics. It's heritable, it has a genetic basis, it's functional, it does something, right? And it's adaptive, and that is it increases reproductive success. And so part of tonight's talk is the question is birdsong an adaptation? Is it adaptive? And in the second half of the talk, we'll discuss that. So first part is going to talk about some of the proximate explanations. So how do birds sing, right? What are some of the mechanisms that are involved? Okay? So basically, birds sing by causing the membranes in their syrinx to vibrate. Just like when we speak, as I'm speaking now, right? The air that's going through my larynx and my vocal cords are causing my vocal cords to vibrate. Our sound box is located here. In birds, it's located at the junction of the two bronchi going to the lungs, right? So the trachea comes down and the syrinx is located right here. Right? And so you can see on the picture, the diagram, right? And then in the upper left is pigeon dissection, and you can see the syrinx right over there. Right? And it's kind of like the trachea, is that it has cartilage rings around it, but it has membranes on either side of it. And as air passes by those membranes, they vibrate, producing sound. And if they move slowly, the air moves slowly and the membranes are loose, the membranes vibrate slowly and produce deeper sounds. If the membrane is tight and the air moves fast, the membranes vibrate very fast and it produces high-pitched sounds. Right? That's kind of an approximate explanation. And let's see if we can watch this quick video here. We'll just watch a couple seconds of it. And you can see that the syrinx vibrate. Now, one of the most interesting things about this, right? One of the most interesting things about it is that in some birds, right? Some birds have a lot of control over their syrinx. So think about something that just produces kind of a harsh sound like a crow. And it's just kind of, that's it. But something like some thrushes, they can actually control the rate of sound going on the right side versus the left side of the syrinx, so they can actually sing in harmony of themselves. So they can produce a high-pitched sound and a low-pitched sound simultaneously. Right? And so what we see here again is our wood thrush, right? And if we look at these sound spectrograms, right, the frequency determines the number of cycles per second. That determines the pitch. So if it's a high-frequency sound, right, it's a high-pitched sound. If it's a low-frequency sound, it's a low-pitched sound. And if you look at these diagrams, the amplitude of these lines, let me move this chair out. If you see the amplitude of these lines here, that indicates the amount of energy in the sound, how loud the sound is. Right? That's one way to interpret those sonograms you see in like a field guide, for example. Here's our wood thrush again. And of course, the thrushes are excellent songsters. And they have a lot of control over the sounds going through, the air going through their syrinx. Right? And so there are three ways that we can look at, visually, interpret sounds that our birds are producing, right? So you can see that black and white spectrogram right there, and I'll play the song here, right? So the song you're all familiar with, right? With a black-capped chicken saying, "Hey, sweetie." And the oscillogram up there, the thickness is showing the amount of energy in those sounds. And now we can be even more fancy, right? And we're doing this color spectrogram, and the intensity of a color indicates how much energy is in the sound. So the more intense the color, the more energy in the sound. And of course, on the bottom is the amount of time. And these are the frequencies, right? So the hey part is a higher frequency than the sweetie part. So it's a higher pitch sound than the sweetie part. And so that means that when the air is going through, to go back to what we said before, when the air going through the syrinx, right, the membranes are vibrating faster here than they're vibrating there. This is a complicated diagram about the areas in the brain that control bird song. And I really just want to focus on two parts of this. the higher vocal center and the RA, the robust nucleus of the archistriatum, right? And you can see the HVC is in green, the RA is in that kind of tan color. They connect to this N12TS that's in the brainstem. That controls song production. So that controls, those nerves control the muscles that are around the syrinx that control the rate of air going through the syrinx, and it controls the amount of tension on the membranes in the syrinx, whether they're going to vibrate slowly or vibrate really fast. Okay? The LMAN and the X are involved in song learning. Right? Those are involved in song learning. Now it gets more interesting because those structures change in size over the course of the year. Right? So the higher vocal center, the size is influenced by photoperiod and social stimulation. So as the days get longer in the spring, the HVC gets bigger inside of the brain, right? And it gets bigger in males when they're in the presence of females. So they're going to sing more, right, to attract females, something we'll talk about in the second half. The RA, the robust nucleus of the archistriatum, is critical for strong song production. So we know that by doing experiments in the lab, by destroying the RA and then the bird can't sing, for example. It's larger in males than females because on average males sing more often than do females, although there are some species in which females sing. And its size changes seasonally. So it's really tiny in the non-breeding season, but it gets bigger during the breeding season when males are singing to attract females and to repel territorial rivals and so on. The LMAN, right, which is involved in song learning, is really important because if it's destroyed early in the life of a bird, it inhibits song learning. They can't learn, right? And in birds that don't learn their songs, some of the birds, like some of the flycatchers, for example, that don't learn their songs, that LMAN is relatively small compared to other birds that do learn their songs, right? So it's small in birds that don't learn their songs and bigger, relatively bigger, in birds that do learn their songs. So this is marsh wren. Actually, if I do this. So it's marsh wren singing, right? So the amount of brain space that's devoted to song varies, right? Varies a bit, right? It varies with repertoire size. Varies with repertoire size. So the bigger the repertoire, something like a mockingbird, brown thrasher, European starlings have big repertoires. Right? The amount of brain space that is involved in song production is larger than birds that have small repertoires that sing the same song over and over. Right? California marsh wrens have 3 times the number of songs as New York marsh wrens. Right? And so 40% more of brain space is devoted to song. Right? So more of their brain is devoted to producing song. And the song nuclei size varies with season, right? So it gets big during the breeding season and smaller during the non-breeding season. And so there's obvious differences between males and females. So one of the classic birds that's used for study in the laboratory are zebra finches, right? As are white-crowned sparrows. And you can see in zebra finches, right? So if you look at them at 10 days after hatching, if you look at the number of neurons in the higher vocal center, males and females are about the same. In fact, females have a little bit more of neurons. But as they get older, there's a big divergence in the number of nuclei that are in those song production regions of the brain. So that by the time they are 60 days old, 2 months old, there's a lot more neurons that are devoted to song in males than there are in females. And this time period is really critical, as we'll see in a minute, because for many birds that learn their songs, they have to hear their species typical song within 50 to 60 days of hatching. If they don't hear it then, like if they're kept in isolation in a laboratory, they never sing the species typical song correctly. So they have to hear it. If they don't hear it, they don't sing the song correctly. And then it has an interesting parallel to language acquisition in humans, in that human babies that are raised in isolation for a variety of really bad reasons, and they don't hear much human speech, they have trouble developing speech later on. So there seems to be what's called a critical period where you have to hear it. And your neurons, the neurons in their brains are really kind of primed for hearing their species typical song, as we'll see in a minute. So this is another complicated diagram, but what I want you to focus on this diagram is especially these tan lines here, right? And so there's a human brain on the right, bird brain on the left. The structures are really kind of different, but there's molecular similarities. For example, in this hindbrain region where the neurons control our larynx muscles and our speech, and this X2 region in the bird's hindbrain that controls the trachea and the syrinx muscles. So there's molecular similarities, same molecules are involved. And there are other molecular similarities as well. Area X in the anterior striatum, and then in the upper part of the brain, in our cortex, in those regions in birds that are involved in song learning as well. So the Broca region in our brain that's involved with language is related to the HVC, molecularly related to the HVC in birds. So vocal learning has undergone what's called convergent evolution in song learning birds and mammals, including humans. That means they've converged on the same kind of solution to the problem of producing sounds that are used in communication. Area X in birds is similar to the part of the human brain that is activated during speech production. And there's a gene called FOXP2 is expressed in both areas, and we're going to talk about FOXP2 in just a minute. That gene is really important for song production in birds, the squeaks that mice make, for example, and it's very important for language acquisition and language production in humans. Right? So for humans, as we just saw in the other diagram, the thing that controls the larynx, right, are analogous to the robust archistriatum, the RA, in birds. So human brains and bird brains are separated by at least 300 million years from the last common ancestor. But they've converged on some of the same solutions to the problem of producing sounds that can be used in communication. And maybe there's only a few ways you can do it. That's what this author thinks. Maybe there's only a few ways you can solve this problem. So now we need to talk a little bit about genetics of song production and song learning. And here we got to focus on the role of FOXP2. Bruce knows more about this than I do. People with have mutations in FOXP2 have problems developing human speech. So it's a rare mutation, but they have difficulty. They don't have any other mental defects, so it's not associated with delayed development or things like that. But they have trouble producing speech, right? Physical trouble producing speech. They can't produce speech, they can't produce language. There's only two differences in that gene between us and chimpanzees. And recent work has shown that that Neanderthals are distant cousins, not so distant cousins, I should say, right? That went extinct about 35,000 years ago, had the same FOXP2 sequence as we do. So it suggests they may have had language. FOXP2 is highly conserved in vertebrates. So I mentioned there's only two differences in FOXP2 between us and chimpanzees. There's not a whole lot of differences between FOXP2 and us and some other mammals, including mice, and so on. So it's a really important gene. So this study looked at the role of FOXP2 learning in song production and learning in birds, and they used zebra finches here. And FOXP2 expression increases during song learning. So the gene produces more gene product during song learning. And if they do some tricks in the laboratory where they knock out FOXP2, so it doesn't produce any of its gene products, you get incomplete and inaccurate imitation of sounds. And those inaccurate songs persist into adulthood. So that gives us some idea that this gene is really important. And this is parallel to the, I should say, go back to our conclusion, right? Normal auditory guided song learning requires FOXP2. And this is similar to language acquisition in humans. And as I said before, birds and humans are separated from their last common ancestor by at least 300 million years. So that gene is really important. So genes are important. So we need to discuss now how birds acquire songs, right? I should mention, if you have any questions as I go along, just raise your hand. I'll see if I can answer. So this is one of the main questions, right? Is it nature or is it nurture? Is it all genetic, right? Or is it environmental? Well, like every other trait, it's both. And the real difficulty that we have as scientists is figuring how much is genetic and how much is environmental. How do those two traits, how do those two causes interact with one another? Song learning occurs in three groups of birds. It occurs in the songbirds, the passerines, right? So the birds that you're familiar with in your yard, like robins and cardinals and white-throated sparrows and so on. It also occurs in parrots, and it also occurs in hummingbirds. So if you look at this phylogeny, which is a fairly recent one, parrots and the songbirds are really fairly closely related to one another. But the hummingbirds are way down here. They're not very closely related to either of those two groups. In fact, a more recent genetic analysis suggests that they're more closely related to things like nighthawks, Capra multiformes. Yeah, Beth is looking at me. Yeah, that's. I talked to one of the guys one time several years ago. He says they were flabbergasted by that as well, because they don't seem related at all. They don't look like they have different diets and so on. But not all birds in those three groups learn songs. In some species, the songs are hardwired. Right? So even though song learning occurs in the passerines and in parrots and in hummingbirds, there are some species within those groups in which the songs are hardwired. So how do we know that some birds learn their songs? Right? We know that there are geographic dialects, which we'll talk about in a minute. Young birds that are raised in auditory isolation never learn their species typical songs. The stuff you can do in the laboratory, right? So with the development of more advanced recording equipment during the Second World War, a lot of scientists really got interested in studying bird song in the post-war period from the 1950s into the 1960s. And so they could take birds and rear them in the laboratory and raise them in complete isolation from hatching up to adulthood, and never sing their species typical song. They have to hear it. And for many of them, like white-crowned sparrows, they have to hear it within 50 days of hatching. If they hear it after that, they'll produce some sounds, but it won't be their species typical sound. If you deafen them, right, then they don't sing the song properly. So it's like with people that are deaf. If they can't hear the sounds that they're producing, they can't modulate those sounds to copy or imitate other person's speech. And so they have to be able to hear what they're singing so that they can match what they're singing with what they've heard other birds sing. And sometimes birds that are reared by tutors will pick up some of the songs of their tutors. So if you raise a white-crowned sparrow, for example, maybe with a strawberry finch, it'll sing the white-crowned sparrow song, but it'll also throw in some syllables from a strawberry finch. So we know that they learn. Now, this is a picture of Margaret Morse Nice, who was a very important ornithologist in the 20th century. And she's most famous for her studies of life history of song sparrows in central Ohio and Franklin County around Columbus. And one of the professors I had as an undergraduate for animal behavior knew her. They overlapped a little bit. And he said that she could tell where in Franklin County a cardinal came from because it had a slightly different accent in different places. So they have dialects, right? And this was studied more scientifically, right? More scientifically by researchers out in California, right? With white-crowned sparrows, right? And you can see one's from Marin County. If you look at their spectrograms, they're very similar, but there's some important differences. So the ones in Marin County sing a song that's slightly different from those that they caught at Berkeley, and then those they caught farther south at Sunset Beach. So a well-trained ornithologist or a bird that really is really good at bird song, right? When they go to California, they can say, well, that's a Marin County bird, that's a Berkeley bird, that's a Sunset Beach bird, from a bird from down by Monterey County, for example. So here's comparing with swamp sparrows, right? Swamp sparrow and song sparrow. That's their normal song, right? If you, as we said before, if you isolate them and their hearing's intact, notice that the tracings are similar, but they're not quite what the song is. Not quite what the song is. And if they're deafened before singing, you just get these kind of buzzy sounds because they can't modulate the sounds they're producing because they can't hear what they're producing and then compare it to songs they may have heard before. So here's a white-crowned sparrow that was tutored by a strawberry finch. And so you see this by A through E and then so on. What it did, it picked up some syllables from the strawberry finch. So it's learning, right? It's learning. Yeah, Carl.
Well, so you mentioned, we're talking about the white-crowned sparrow here, and that they have to hear the species-typical song.
Right.
Earlier you mentioned that the brown-headed cowbirds have maybe a stronger hardwired component to the songs.
Right.
If a parasitic bird like a brown-headed cowbird doesn't hear the species-typical song, will they still have that pattern that you showed with the white-crowned sparrow?
No, a brown-headed cowbird male, right, doesn't have to hear its species-typical song. But as we'll discuss later, they sing, and then they modify their song based on how females are acting towards them, right? So they're learning, right? They modify their song somewhat based on female reactions. So, as I mentioned before, white-crowned sparrow nestlings are predisposed to learn white-crowned sparrow song. In fact, some of the studies that have been done in the laboratory is you can look at the heart rate of these young birds during the song learning period. So a young song sparrow, when it hears song sparrow singing, its heart rate goes up. But if you play a white-crowned sparrow song, so they're predisposed, right? They're predisposed to learn their own species song. So it's clearly genes involved. So here's that white-crowned sparrow. And I have this line drawn here. This is 50 days. They say, the specialists say the neural template is open. They have to hear it. Right? Now, this blank space here suggests that they don't sing at all. But of course, they make songs. They make sounds during them. They vocalize during them. And then this is where it's very parallel to the way that we learn language. Right? So there's a period of subsong, which is very much like babbling in babies. Right? So they babble. Right? And then what they do is try to match the sounds they're producing with the sounds that they hear. Right? And then eventually that song becomes, that's in birds, the song is plastic for a while, and then it becomes what we say is crystallized as a species typical song. Right? And as we learn language, right, we hear it constantly, right? And as when we get to those ages where we start babbling, right? And then we start getting better in the song, the sounds that we're producing, language is really plastic, and then it finally matures. So it's the same pattern. So this is an interesting one that was some work that was done by one of my mentors at the University of Michigan, Bob Payne, who studied indigo buntings in the east side of the state and then down by his home in Niles. And so if you look at the patterns up on top, there's a territory holder's pattern, and then a neighbor's pattern, and then a stranger. And what Bob discovered, let's play the indigo bunting song. What Bob discovered is that if you go to an area where there's a bunch of indigo buntings, right, like along a railroad right away or something like that, where they like to breed, that all of the birds that are in the same area sing songs that are very similar to one another. And then when a new bird comes in, he sings a song that's different from the territory owners. Right? And females don't like him very much until he changes his song to be like the neighborhood song. So he has to sing the neighborhood song for him to be attractive to the male, to females. So And here's another marsh wren. And then some of you are familiar with dueling banjos, right, from the movie Deliverance, right? Where the boy plays the banjo and then Ronnie Cox copies him on the guitar, right? So marsh wrens do the same thing. They have these duels where they sing back and forth. So one of them sings a complex song, the other one copies it. The first one sings another song, the second one copies it, and so on. So that indicates that they're learning. They hear it, and then they copy the song. So the songbirds can be broken up into two groups, the oscines and the sub-oscines. And sub-oscines include things like flycatchers and so on, and some other birds. And typically sub-oscines don't learn their song. Their songs are typically hardwired. But some sub-oscines learn their songs, including the three-wattled bellbird from Costa Rica. And if you look at this chart here, you can see how intense the colors are, because there's a lot of energy in the sounds that they're playing. Let's see if we can get it to play here. We'll just play a minute. It gets louder. So there's a lot of energy in that sound, and they learn their songs. So this is the pattern of song learning, right? Pattern of song learning. So birds hatch out, right? Birds that learn their songs. They hatch out, and they have to hear their species typical song during that when the neural template is open. And of course, they're vocalizing when they're in the nest because they're begging for food from their parents. And then there's a period there where it's sometimes called the silent period, but it's really not silent because they'll do alarm notes, they'll make other stuff, but they don't sing. And then as the next breeding season's approaching, right, the late winter, early spring, the birds from the previous year are going through that babbling period, that sub-song period. And they're starting to modulate the sounds they're producing so that the sounds they're producing are matching the adult males that they're singing. And so it's plastic, and it gets better and better and better, and then it finally gets crystallized, right? So it becomes then the species typical song. So as you can see there, song over, they sing a lot, they produce a lot of syllables and so on. And then they get rid of some of the syllables so that their song matches the species typical song. But the timelines vary among species. So on top is a white-crowned sparrow. And the white-crowned sparrow song acquisition is how I describe it, where they have a sensory period, and then in the autumn through the winter, they start producing sub-song, and the plastic song, and then the following spring, it's crystallized. Then with zebra finches, there's an overlap between the sensory period and the sensor-motor period, and then the song becomes crystallized. Okay? But then in canaries, they can learn new songs each year, so they go through that same pattern each year. So a sensory period, a sensor-motor period, crystallized, then another sensory period, a sensor-motor period, and so on, and then a crystallization. So there are different patterns. Yeah.
You talked about some isolation experiments where they,
right,
the birds, they couldn't pick up these things. If they miss any of those windows, they can't.
They don't sing the species typical song. They don't sing the species typical song. Yeah. Right. But that only happens in laboratories at Indiana and Rockefeller University and places like that. Right? But somebody asked about, Carl, you asked about brood parasites. So cowbirds, say a cowbird's raised in a yellow warbler nest. It doesn't sing yellow warbler song. But there are some finches in Africa that are parasitic and lay their eggs in the nests of other finches. And the parasitic offspring learn the songs of their hosts in those. That's another group of birds that Bob Payne had studied in Africa. So it's a really complex pattern. Those parasites are really interesting because their eggs mimic the eggs of the host they lay their eggs in, and their young have patterns of pigment inside their mouths, and the patterns of pigment inside the mouths of the parasites match the pattern of pigments inside the hosts. So the hosts really get fooled.
So Michael, you mentioned indigo montane. You maybe not learn a new song, but adapt the song?
Yeah, it doesn't learn a new
Where
song,
does
but it
that
does it.
fit?
It's just like if I went to Spain, I can't speak Spanish, and the girls are not interested in me. So as soon as I learn Spanish, then they get interested, or maybe not.
Well, where does that fit in the diagram you showed on the previous slide?
In here,
Because it hasn't.
it's during the
crystallized.
sensory motor period.
Okay, but if it's crystallized, then they're just changing almost their accent.
Yeah, they're
after
changing their
crystallization.
accent.
Okay.
Yeah, so yep. So here's the lyre bird. Yep, yeah.
Dr. Jordan, what would possibly be the benefit of one of those parasitic birds singing the song it's supposed to? What good was that?
Why sing that song?
Why would it do it?
Yeah, what it seems like what they're doing is they become specialized on that particular host, and it attracts females, right? Females of their host species, so they can find the nests. Yeah. So some of you probably see. I'm going to show just a minute or so of the next video of a lyrebird from Australia, right? Which is it's actually in a passer room, right? But it's an incredible mimic. It never fails to. Never fails to amaze people.
What bird has the most elaborate, the most complex, the most beautiful song in the world? Well, I guess there are lots of contenders, but this bird must be one of them. The superb lyrebird, a soft strider.
So notice he uses a visual display too.
To serve as his concert platform. To persuade females to come close and admire his plumes, he sings the most complex song he can manage. And he does that by copying the songs of all the other birds he hears around him, such as the kookaburra. It's a very convincing impersonation. Even the original is fooled. He can imitate the calls of at least 20 different species. He also, in his attempt to outsing his rivals, incorporates other sounds that he hears in the forest. That was a camera shutter. And again. And now a camera with a motor drive. And that's a car alarm. And now the sounds of foresters and their chainsaws working nearby.
So a bird like that, well, it's a visual display, right? A bird like that has incredible control, right? Muscular control of the syrinx to produce sounds like that, right? On both the left side and the right side of the syrinx. And then in the second half, the third, what we'll talk about is like, why does he produce so many different sounds, right? Why do thrashers produce so many different sounds? Why do mockingbirds produce so many sounds? Why do European starlings, which can mimic as well? So we studied starlings in New Jersey, and there was one starling that would make a mimic an American robin and a cardinal. And when I first started at Grand Valley in the old biology building, there was a European starling that used to sit out front and mimic the calls of red-tailed hawks. And if you work really hard with the European starling, you can actually get it to say a few words. So like, because they're related to minor birds, right? Minor birds can copy human speech. So development and activity of song is influenced by changes in photoperiod, it's influenced by hormone levels, acoustical stimulation, social stimulation. All of those things can influence the songs that birds sing. Yeah.
What is photo period?
Oh, the amount of daylight, the amount of daylight.
Only on a
Daylight, right? So as spring approaches, right, and days are getting longer, there's an increase in the size of those vocal centers in the brain. Right? But there are other factors involved too, something called mirror neurons. And so those mirroring neurons, there are neurons in the bird's brain that become active when they hear other birds sing. And so it's thought that maybe the mirror neurons facilitate imitation. Then sleep and learning seems to be important as well, because there's brain activity in the vocal centers of the brain while the birds are sleeping. And so it suggests that maybe their brain is rehearsing their songs while they sleep. And so when I would show this slide in class, that's why I would tell students that sleep is really important, right? Before exams, because you've learned a whole bunch of stuff, right? Because our brains do the same sorts of things. So, you know, we've already talked about brood parasites like this brown-headed cowbird, right? We've all heard of brown-headed cowbird. To our ears, that's just glug, glug, glee, right? But to a female cowbird, she's hearing something a little more complex than that. And so, as we said before, with the brown-headed cowbird, it doesn't have to hear its species typical song, but when it starts singing the next breeding season, a new one starts singing the next breeding season, he modifies his song based on how females react to him. So as they seem that they like him more, then they keep singing those same syllables. Right? It's hardwired, but they modify it based on experience. Okay? So any quick questions? Yeah.
Did you ever learn much about blue jays? Are blue jays considered mimics because they mimic red-tailed hawk sounds?
They can mimic red-tailed hawk sounds. I don't think too much work has been done with blue jays. Members of the Corvidae, some members of the Corvidae, crows, ravens, and jays are really babblers, not babblers, crows, ravens, and jays, magpies. They're really hard to study because they're really smart. So it's birds that are well known, but we don't know them well. We know crows because people have been studying crows at the University of Washington for a long time, and ravens are hard to study. Blue jays are hard to study because they're smart. So why do birds sing, right? How does singing increase reproductive success? And a lot of this seems really pretty obvious, right, to us. So this is a bad copy of this little comic I found in the newspaper one time where the bird is singing. It says, "The perennial favorite. This is my treat, and if you even think of flying near here, I'll peck your eyes out." That's what he's telling other males. Really, that's what he's telling other males. Here's another cartoon with the same theme. Buzz off, buzz off, buzz off. And the other one says, make me, make me, make me. I mean, that's what the males are really communicating to one another. Right? So why do males sing? Well, one reason they sing is to repel territorial rivals. So a European starling song. It's really a complex song. Because if you slow it down, it has lots of different syllables in it. And as we just mentioned, they can mimic the songs of other birds, right? So what Mountjoy and Lemon did is they put up paired nest boxes and played songs at some and no songs at others, right? The females were attracted to the ones where the males were singing. And then they played simple songs versus complex songs. And 90% of males were attracted to the one where simple songs were played. Now, why would that be? Part of the reason why that would be is that they probably can repel that male if they have a more complex song and be attractive to females, because if we look at the timing of breeding and the complexity of a male starling song, his repertoire size, the number of songs that he can sing, right? And this is days until the first egg, and this is repertoire size. And so you can see the larger the male's repertoire size, right? The larger the male's repertoire size, the faster females start mate with them and breed. And that's usually advantageous because the earlier you breed in the season, the greater chance you have is to produce fledged offspring that are going to come back the following year. So a large repertoire size is probably a signal to females of something about the male's quality, right? He's been able to live long enough to acquire a lot of songs, right? So if you went to like a U2 concert or Rolling Stones concert or Bruce Springsteen concert, they could play for hours and hours, right? Because they've accumulated so many songs. But if you go to some local, garage band, it's only a handful of songs, right? Because they haven't had the time to acquire all those songs. And so that might tell females something. If he's been able to live this long, he's probably high quality, maybe I should mate with him. And they prefer males with complex songs and large repertoires. Doesn't sound like much to us, but to female starlings, they sing to attract females, right? So this is a male Great Tits in England, play their song. Not as nice as a story. So. You hear the trucks on that. So in this experiment, they removed the mate from the male, right? So before the mate was removed, they didn't sing very much. They take their female away, they start singing a lot. Why do they start singing a lot? Because they're trying to attract another mate. Right? And once he attracts another mate, the singing rate goes down, right? So they nearly stop singing when they have a mate. They start singing again when she's removed, and they nearly stop singing again when she's returned. So that's indirect evidence, but they sing to attract mates. Here are a couple of birds that are common in Scandinavia, collared and pied flycatchers, and they nest in holes, so they're easy to study because you put up bird houses for them. And so these guys put up 28 nest boxes, and they played songs at 14, and at 14 nests they were silent. So at 14 nests they had a model, and they played the song, and at 14 nests it was completely silent. 90% of the females they trapped were trapped inside of nest boxes where there was the model nearby and the song. So that suggests that females are attracted to the song, just like with starlings. They also sing to guard their mates, right? Because many species of birds, female birds, will participate in extra pair matings. And so male singing mates, as you can see here, this is the graphs, a little hard to interpret sometimes because our tendency is to read from left to right, but this is 1 day before the first day. This is 21 days before the first day. And so male singing rates increase in relation to female fertility, right? So when females are close to laying eggs, the males are singing a lot, probably to guard their mates from rival males that might try to intrude on their territories and participate in those extra pair meetings. So they're communicating, right? They're communicating something to females, and the songs probably are related something to their quality. Now, one thing that you may have noticed, especially if you've been a birder for a long time, watch a lot of nature films, it seems like the birds that are more dully colored seem to have more elaborate songs. And it may be that they're investing in song rather than in bright plumage. And we see that in the bowerbirds in Papua New Guinea and in Australia. The ones that are most brightly colored seem to have the simplest bowers that are used to attract females. These are the structures that the birds build. And the ones that are really dully colored have the most elaborate bowers that are really big and really, really decorated. So there's communication going involved. And communication occurs when one individual transmits information to a receiver. So there's a transmitter and a receiver, and the way that it can be looked at is the transmitter is sending information to a receiver to manipulate the behavior of the receiver relative to the transmitter. Right? So the males are trying to manipulate the behavior of the females, right? Get the females to mate with them. So the question we always have to ask when we talk about communication, is communication truthful or deceitful? Right? Because as we all know, right, that you can lie during communication to your advantage, right, by manipulating the behavior of other individuals. So sometimes that communication, they're not really singing here, but they're vocalizing, like these Florida scrub jays. Those alarm notes are truthful. So they have what's called sentinel behavior. Babblers do this as well. So and crows do this as well. Ravens. So while some individuals are foraging, other individuals are located in different places, and if they see danger, they start producing alarm notes, and everybody takes cover. So like with these Florida, that's truthful communication. But many species, not many species, but in some species of birds, we see what are known as false alarm notes, right? That's manipulating the behavior of others, right? And some birds lie about current environmental conditions. And this is these false alarm notes. These are white-fronted bee-eaters from East Africa that was studied by Steve Emblem. What males will do sometimes is if another male is intruding on they live in these big colonies, and so the females participate in extra-pair matings. And so if a male is coming in and a non-pair male is coming in and interested in a particular female or hanging around near a female, her mate will do a false alarm note. The guy scatters. So that's manipulating his behavior, right? Because he's lying about environmental. There's really not a predator, but he's just trying to get that other bird to go away. This was more closely studied in the Amazonian rainforest in Peru by Charlie Munn. And the paper that was called "Birds That Cry Wolf." And these birds go around in these multi-species flocks, right, as they're foraging through the rainforest. And in the upper canopy, white-winged shrike tanagers will sometimes give false alarm notes, and so everybody scatters, right? Because you can't take a chance, right? Because if you say no, he's just faking, maybe there really is a predator, and you're dead. And he does that because as they scatter, insects become more available to him, right? And in the understory, the bluish slate antshrike does the same thing. Right? So they're all foraging around, like you see mixed species of flocks, at your bird feeders, with black-capped chickadees and white-breasted nuthatches and downy woodpeckers and tufted mice and so on. Right? So this bluish slate antshrike gives a false alarm note. Everybody scatters, and that bird goes and picks up the bugs that are flushed up by all these birds scattered. So birds communicate, they vocalize, they sing to manipulate the behavior of others to their own benefit, like males to attract females, for example, or to get better, easier access to food. So there's a good cartoon from the New Yorker, right? So why do birds sing? I don't sing because I'm happy. I'm happy because I sing. So when humans sing, we produce endorphins in our brain that make us happy. This is work that's done by a guy down at Duke named Eric Jarvis. Birds produce endorphins in their brain when they sing as well. So the implication is singing makes birds happy. So, how do birds sing? Song emanates from the syrinx, right? As air passes over those membranes. Regions in the brain are dedicated to song. There are strong genetic components like FOXP2 gene and other genes that build those structures in the brain. And learning is important in many species. Birds that modify their songs or acquire their songs through learning. Why do they sing? Right? They sing to defend their territories, right? To repel territorial rivals. They sing to attract and defend their mates, right? They sing to manipulate the behavior of other individuals, right? And maybe it makes them happy to sing, whatever happiness is in a bird, right? It may make them happy. So, in conclusion, it's always important to remember that bird song is what we call a phenotype. That's what you see when you look at an organism. Like when you look at me, what you're seeing is my phenotype, and you're hearing my phenotype. And for any phenotype, what you have to remember is that the phenotype results from the interaction between the genes that make up me and the environment within which I was raised. And as we said before, one of the real challenges we always have is how much of the phenotype is due to genes, how much is due to environment, and it's always the two that are involved. So before I finish, I always put a plug in for some of you are aware of this website, allaboutbirds.org, from the Cornell lab. It has excellent amounts of copious information about birds. You can find any answer to most questions you have by looking at All About Birds. I look at it a lot. When I taught ornithology, I would use it all the time. Also, if you go to the All About Birds website, you can find Bird Song Hero to help you learn songs and learn how to interpret spectred song sonograms. And so, thanks for listening, and if I'll see if I can answer any questions that you might have. Yeah.
I have a question that doesn't relate to this topic. How long do birds live?
How long do birds live? That's a good question. Depends on the kind of bird. Small birds tend to live shorter lives than large birds, right? So, but there are some good examples in the literature of even small birds like hummingbirds living several years. But what you have to remember is that of all the birds that fledged last year in 2022, 90 to 95% of them have perished before they even get to this breeding season. So, and they die for a variety of reasons. And most of them, for migratory species, most of them die during migration. And when they make it to their first breeding season, about 50%, for songbirds especially, about 50% of them make it to the next breeding season. And 50%. So before you know it, they're all gone. So most songbirds, you know, if you see like robins in your yard, they probably average like maybe 3 or 4 breeding seasons. And for some birds,
How long did you say the robin might?
maybe 4 or 5, 6 breeding seasons tops.
Seasons?
Seasons, yeah, years. Yeah. But then there are things like, you know, it's like really big birds like albatrosses that are 50, 60 years old. Right? Yeah.
When you talked about which birds sing, you said the passerines and then
Parrots.
parrots.
Well, they vocalize. I wouldn't call parrots do singing, but
So, what do raptors do? They don't. I mean,
they
so-
vocalize.
So it's called vocalizing.
Yeah, it's called, but it's not really song because it's one of those things. They're really it's more of a. I don't know.
So what separates song from vocalizing?
Uh,
Is that a tricky one?
that's a tricky one because the auditory elements are the same. You know, in a sense. I mean, the sounds they come from the same place.
Yeah.
It's songs are more, from our perspective, are more melodious, right? Rather than like a screech owl or red-tailed hawk or something. Yes.
So during that warm spell was when I heard that thrasher
Mm-hmm.
and sitting by my front window, which was old. The song was just mesmerizing.
Right.
And I was barn. So I guess my question is, birds vocalizing like that is very complicated. Then he flew off. Is he going to go a mile away and do it again, or
Well,
what do we know about that kind of behavior? If he doesn't get a response,
if he doesn't get a response, well, usually they'll come back. Males will come back before females, typically to establish territories. So maybe the singing right now is to establish his territory ownership, right? But you know, and then when a female shows up, then if he can attract a female, it's good to go. But I can't remember what year it was, but one year out in the fields where I was doing tree swallow stuff, there was a male bobolink, and we watched them, one bobolink, and we watched them all of May and most of June. He was singing his heart out. There was never any female. Just every day, just sing and sing and sing. But there was no female around, right? So he's hanging out in the wrong place. You gotta find a better field. Yeah, right.
What possible advantages might there be to the various mimics, you know, like the bird you showed there and like mockingbirds and stuff, making sounds that even are not other birds? So,
Right. I think
what good does that do then?
because they have a larger repertoire.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Females are attracted.
Okay,
The work has shown that, yeah, the bigger the repertoire, the more attractive you are to females, right? So that's why I think, like we said before, if you think about rock groups, like the Rolling Stones, right? The bigger the repertoire, the more groupies compared to your local bar band.
So something with the female of its own species, we can make themselves seem like a better bird.
Better bird. Yeah, higher quality individual. Yeah, higher quality individual. Because he's lived long enough to acquire all those songs, right? Just like those groups, they've been around 40 years to acquire all those songs. Yeah.
Hummingbirds, based on what I got from the chart, they were like, with the learned song, they evolved that much earlier than the parrots and songbirds did.
Not necessarily earlier, but they're in a different group of birds. So you can find it.
So like, why is that?
Why did they? Your question is why did they learn songs?
I mean, why did the hummingbirds learn songs and they're like,
That's a good question. No, it really is. I mean, it's a serious question. Why did they learn songs and apparently things that they're closely related to, like nighthawks and others, whippoorwills and stuff, don't learn their songs as far as we know. Yeah, I don't know. That's a really good question. Yeah. See, they're down here for the Caprimulgiformes, where these guys put the swifts and the nightjars together, and then the hummingbirds over here, they're vocal learners.
Any examples of female singers?
Yeah, in some species you hear females sing, but not nearly as much as
To
some.
attract a mate?
Probably, maybe to attract a mate, or to keep away territory, to defend territories. So for example, and females will do that. So, as you know, red-winged blackbirds, males will have multiple females on their territory. But females have sub-territories inside that bigger male's territory. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I was reading that the canyon wren female will sing.
What's that? Yeah, wrens.
And then the male is like supposed to, the ability that he has to like maybe harmonize, if that's the right word, or respond.
They duet with each other.
Are there other species that do that kind of back and forth?
I can't think of it off the top of my head.
I had another quick question. If you're mentioning the older rockers with
Yeah.
this repertoire.
Large repertoire.
Then-
Like a mockingbird with a large repertoire.
Right. Then, what are the females of like the brown-headed cowbird we're listening for that would be different, given that the song is hardwired?
Well, don't forget it's hardwired, but they modify it,
Right.
right? Based on how the females are reacting to it. And we know from things like indigo buntings and some others that there's cultural evolution in the songs. So the songs change, not a lot, but they change over time as they learn songs. Like with the indigo buntings, where you have a neighborhood and a new male comes in, and he picks up the song that all the males in the neighborhood are singing, right? But he's also added some of his syllables into that song, right? And eventually, as the other ones die off, the song changes a little bit over time. So there's cultural evolution. Nothing's going on different genetically, but there's cultural evolution, just like you pick up a different language, you learn different songs and stuff. Yeah.
It's a vocal anatomy question, I guess. It's just how do they sing? Birds sing so loud. So often it's a tiny bird like a house wren. You would think volume had to do with lung capacity, but they can't have very large lungs.
No, birds have very small lungs, but they have part of their respiratory system are air sacs. Gas exchange doesn't occur in the air sacs, but they push air through those air sacs and then through the syrinx. So they can actually push a lot of air through the syrinx. I saw a talk by an avian anatomist one time, and you may notice sometimes when crows call, you see that their tail bobs down. And what he argued was what they're doing is and their calls can be loud. What he argued what they're doing is their muscles, when they're doing that, are compressing those air sacs and pushing a lot of air then through their syrinx to produce those loud sounds.
Is that a venturi? Is that like a venturi shape? Because that would explain it.
Yeah, maybe that's what it is. So
if you imagine a funnel, when you shove air through a funnel, it speeds up tremendously through the funnel. So it acts like a venturi. It's how an airplane has a lift. It's the same way. You know, it's like a.
Yeah, just this is a comment, but I always watch Song Sparrow sing, and of course, because our larynx is here, I can't imagine sticking my chest out and then making a huge sound. But if
But
there's
it's coming from down
so
here.
it's either chest puffing out,
Right.
and, you know,
And then
it
they're
does make a lot of sense.
right, and they're so when birds inhale, it doesn't go to their lungs right away. It goes to their. It takes like 2 cycles for air to go through. So it goes to their posterior air sacs first, and then it goes to their lungs where gas exchange occurs. Then it goes to their anterior air sacs, right? And then it goes like through the syrinx and then out when they're singing. So they're pushing air through when they're singing, like that bell, like the 3-bottle bellbird. They're pushing a lot of air. There's a lot of energy in that sound. Yeah, John.
I think it's also the perception, like the wren sounds really loud. It's a larger bird, really the decibels, some of them can let out. It's just that you're not often that close to them.
Yeah, well, that's part. Yeah, it's probably part of it too.
Incredible decibels. I mean, you do not want to really pet a call or.
Yeah, pet macaw, right? Something like that.
That's why.
Yeah, like a bellbird. Yeah, you could.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
bird. The decibels are
Yeah.
incredible.
So,
So maybe
and
that just sounds all because it's maybe your backyard. But
it's still pretty
decibels
loud.
are pretty weird.
So any other questions? Yeah, Beth.
After spending your whole life studying birds and knowing so much about their anatomy and their genetic expression, do you have a favorite bird? Do you have a bird that you like to hear every breeding season because it
Yeah. So a couple things. So first is, like I always tell my students, the more I know, the less I know.
yes,
The more I know, the less I know.
yeah.
My favorite bird is the black skimmer. The black skimmer you find in coastal areas. They're just so graceful flyers, and they have that clown-like beak, and
Okay,
so
that's so interesting because they don't sing.
they don't sing.
Here you study bird song.
No, I didn't study birds. But right now, I studied tree swallows from 1980 to 2018. But now I'm getting really partial in terms of beauty to black-throated blue warblers. Black-throated blue warblers. Yeah.
Do you make it a point to go try to see?
I try to see them. Yeah. Try to see 'em. Yeah, sure.
Sort of a follow-up question to that. When you're trying to explain to non-birders why you care so much about birds, what is it that you find has sort of driven you to want to focus your life on?
Yeah.
Explain
To
to a
non-bird. That's a hard one because I approached it from a different perspective. I was interested in a variety of scientific questions, and birds are easy to work on. But I know some of my colleagues, a very accomplished ornithologist, I asked him how he got into this. He said he was a Brit, and he said he was a twitcher a birder since he was 8 years old. So he approached it that way from birds, and I'll study birds. And I was interested in a variety of evolutionary questions, and birds were easy to study. But there's so much stuff to know, right? There's so much stuff. And we know birds, we know about the biology, we know more about the biology of birds than we know about the biology of lots of other creatures, because they're active when we're active during the day most of the time. And they're very obvious parts of our environments, right? So when you walk outside, you walk anywhere, you see birds all the time. How often do you see mice? How often do you see bats? Fish are underwater, right? But it's easy to study. It's easy to study birds because they're brightly colored, they sing, right? And they're out when we're out. Yeah.
In the scientific world, is it ever related to human music came from birds?
Well, some composers Mozart, for example, incorporated Starling's song in some of his music. And there's French composer Messiaen, who used bird sounds in some of his music as well. Oh, you're asking whether, yeah, that's a good question. Why music is a really big question, trying to understand why we produce music.
Yes.
And why it has such an emotional impact on us. And a lot of people have thought about that, but I don't think anybody really has any sort of satisfactory explanation. No, let me put it this way. No one's had an explanation that satisfies everybody. What? The endorphins.
Like
Maybe it's in,
anything else, humans do things when they get an endorphin.
Elvis had lots of girls.
what's that? Elvis had lots of girls. That's part of it. Why do women? Why do, I mean, just go on, you know, it's a hard, I mean, there, and this relates to some of the research I've done and other things, but there are three things that really jazz people, right, that attract really big crowds. Religion, music, and sports, right, with 100,000 people or more. So why? So music and religion are kind of the hardest ones, nuts to crack. Sports are a lot easier. Why we do that? It's because it's practice for a bunch of things.
Michael, you referred only once to a common ancestor.
Right.
What was? You want to talk a little?
Well, so the common ancestor between mammals and birds was like 300 million years ago. So that was a long time ago, before the different lineages from reptile ancestors split off. So it was but we still see some of the molecular similarities because that FOXP2 gene is really conserved. Yeah, sure.
Church and music, what was the third?
Oh, yeah, religion, music, and sports. And sports, yeah. Think about the crowds,
Yeah.
right? Think about the crowds for those. And how excited, the effect it has on people's emotions. And like I said, the music and religion have been really kind of hard nuts to crack from an evolutionary perspective to find out what's the adaptive value of music. That seems a little easier than religion. Sports is pretty easy to figure out.
Let's go Mets.
Let's go Mets.
Thank you.
Very
Michael.
nice.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.